He signed the papers to fire her without a second thought. But when her little girl walked into his office holding a drawing, the millionaire's world cracked open. Adrian Cross sat at his desk with the skyline stretched wide behind him, towers of steel and glass reflecting the fading light of late afternoon. His office was quiet, except for the faint hum of air vents and the soft tapping of his pen against a folder. On the screen in front of him glowed a chart filled with red marks and overdue deadlines, a neat arrangement of numbers and graphs that told him more, he believed, than any personal story ever could. He leaned back in his chair, reading through the final report from HR, and felt the familiar weight of decision settle across his shoulders. It was not a heavy weight, not really, more like a routine pressure he had trained himself to carry since his 20s, the kind that came with running an empire built on rules and results. The name at the top of the file was Mara Diaz, Junior Compliance Analyst. Adrian scanned the page quickly, the notes repeating the same pattern. Late arrivals, missed targets, unexplained absences. Each line was a small strike, one after another, until the file looked like a report card marked in permanent ink. He did not know her face well. He could not remember ever exchanging more than a polite nod in the hallway, and yet here he was, deciding the course of her future with a signature. He told himself it was necessary, that companies did not run on sympathy, they ran on accountability. His own mother had once told him that success required learning to see numbers before names, and over time he had come to believe it. Adrian picked up the dismissal order and read the simple language that had been written by HR, careful, neutral, stripped of feeling. It did not mention the person herself, it only mentioned the role, the function, the metrics not met. He felt no hesitation as he reached for his pen. People had been fired before, people would be fired again, and each time the company continued to move forward, each time the line on the quarterly graph steadied a little more. He placed his signature neatly on the line, a flourish at the end, and set the pen down with the finality of a judge delivering a sentence. He closed the folder and turned back to the window, the city alive beneath him, traffic crawling like veins of light, people moving through streets he no longer walked himself. Somewhere in that city, Mara Diaz would soon be packing her desk, carrying a box with photographs and papers, walking out through the revolving doors that reflected the company's logo. He imagined it briefly, then pushed the thought away. He had trained himself to let those images dissolve before they gained any weight. To him, it was another decision, one of hundreds he made each week, one of thousands across his career. Numbers told him what to do, and numbers had never lied. That was the lesson he trusted, even when it left silence in its wake. Mara sat stiffly in the small conference room, the walls painted a sterile shade of cream that seemed designed to make everyone forget they had feelings. Across from her, the HR manager adjusted his glasses and spoke in a practiced voice, calm and polite, but distant. He read from the file as if it were the only thing that mattered, listing late arrivals, missed targets, and unexplained absences. His tone carried no curiosity, no kindness, only the smooth rhythm of someone who had done this many times before. Mara's hands clenched in her lap, nails biting into her skin, but she stayed quiet because she knew there was no point in speaking. Each line he recited felt like a brick stacking against her, building a wall she could not climb. She wanted to explain that the bus schedules never lined up, that sometimes she had to carry her daughter's inhaler across town in the middle of the night, that doctor visits turned quick mornings into desperate sprints. She wanted to say that behind every late arrival was a reason. Behind every absence was a small child who could not be left alone. Behind every missed target was exhaustion that came from working twice as hard to hold everything together. But she knew they would not listen. The file had already made its judgment, and judgment did not care about explanations. The HR manager closed the folder gently and gave her a small, rehearsed smile. The kind of smile meant to soften the blow, though it carried no warmth. He explained that it was not personal, that sometimes these things happened, that the company valued her contributions but needed to move in another direction. His words fell like polished stones, smooth and heavy, leaving no space for breath. Mara nodded, as if she understood, though her chest ached with the weight of what was being taken from her. She imagined the desk she would soon have to clear, the small plant she had coaxed to life in the corner, the framed drawing her daughter had made of their tiny apartment, with hearts drawn above the roof. She thought of the bus rides home, of the groceries she would no longer be able to buy, of the rent that would hang above her like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Her face remained still, because she had learned long ago that showing too much only made things worse. The HR manager slid an envelope across the table, papers inside, detailing her separation, her final paycheck, her benefits expiring at the end of the month. She picked it up with steady fingers, though her heart felt unsteady, and thanked him in a voice that barely sounded like her own. She rose from the chair, her knees weak, and walked out of the room without looking back. In the hallway, the world went on as usual, coworkers tapping at keyboards, printers humming, phones ringing. No one looked up, no one noticed. To them she was just another employee leaving early, another name they would forget by tomorrow. To Mara it was the end of something fragile she had been holding together with both hands, and now those hands were empty. The elevator doors closed with a quiet hiss, and Mara found herself staring at the silver walls that reflected her faint outline. A woman with tired eyes carrying a cardboard box that seemed heavier than its contents. Inside were the pieces of her desk, the plant with its soil wrapped in a plastic bag, a photo of her daughter in a cracked frame, a few pens, and a folder of papers she had meant to finish, but now never would. She shifted the box against her hip and pressed the button for the lobby, the cool light of the panel blinking back at her as if to confirm she was leaving for good. The elevator began to descend, smooth and steady, and the silence pressed around her like a thick blanket. She could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent light overhead, the hum of machinery hidden behind panels, and the soft rattle of something in her box. Each floor passed with a blink of a number, neat and orderly, unlike the life unraveling in her hands. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, sharp against her thigh, and she balanced the box awkwardly to pull it out. The first message was from the daycare, reminding her of the overdue payment. The second was a notice from the utility company, warning of disconnection if the balance was not cleared soon. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the buttons, but she had no reply to give. No words could cover the truth that she had just lost the only paycheck keeping them afloat. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and pressed the box closer to her chest, as if holding it tighter might keep everything else from spilling out. The numbers continued to blink past, 38, 37, 36, each one bringing her closer to the street below, where she would have to step out into the world with no job, no plan, only the knowledge that she had failed again. She thought of her daughter's wide eyes, asking if they would still have their apartment, if she could still go to school with her friends, if dinner would still be waiting on the table at night. Mara had no answers that would make sense to a child, only promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Her reflection in the silver panel looked like a stranger, shoulders slumped, lips pressed tight, a woman who had once believed she could build something steady but now only carried fragments. She remembered the mornings when she used to ride this same elevator with Hope, rehearsing presentations in her head, checking notes, trying to prove she was worth the chance she had been given. Those mornings seemed far away now, as if they belonged to someone else. The elevator slowed, the hum shifting as the ground floor neared. Mara steadied the box in her arms and drew in a shaky breath, her pulse loud in the silence. The doors would open, people would glance, and life would go on around her as if nothing had happened. But for her, everything had changed, and she had no choice but to step out and face it. Adrian returned to his office, with his mind already moving to the next task, the next meeting, the next line on the chart that demanded his focus. The dismissal order was signed and filed. The matter of Mara Diaz closed in his head like a drawer pushed shut. He set his coffee on the polished desk and loosened his tie, ready to skim through numbers that promised to distract him from anything personal. The city beyond the glass walls shimmered with late afternoon light, cars streaming below like tiny veins of silver and red, and he felt the familiar comfort of control returning, the sense that his world was in order once again. Then the heavy oak door creaked open, not with the brisk push of an assistant, but with a gentler motion, hesitant but certain. Adrian looked up, expecting perhaps the HR manager with a question, but instead saw a small hand on the brass handle. Fingers curled around it tightly. The door swung wider, and into the room stepped a girl no older than 7. She was small, her dark hair pulled back with a worn elastic, her shoes scuffed, as if they had walked too many miles. In her hand she clutched a folded piece of paper, edges bent and creased, held against her chest like something precious. For a moment Adrian thought she had wandered into the wrong place, a visitor lost in the labyrinth of hallways. But then her eyes met his, and he saw they were steady, not the eyes of someone confused, but of someone who had come with purpose. He straightened in his chair, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched. He cleared his throat, asked softly if she was looking for someone, but she did not answer right away. Instead, she took a few steps closer, the sound of her small shoes almost lost against the thick carpet. She stopped in front of his desk, barely tall enough to see over the polished surface, and carefully unfolded the paper she had been holding. She placed it on the desk in front of him with both hands, then looked up again, waiting. Adrian glanced down. It was a drawing made in bright markers, uneven lines and shapes that carried the unmistakable honesty of a child's hand. He saw a tall building with windows, a woman holding the hand of a smaller figure, and above them, written in large crooked letters, were the words, "Please don't let us fall." His chest tightened, an unexpected ache blooming where he usually felt only calculation. He looked back at her, still unsure, and asked who she was. Her voice was small but clear when she answered. She said her name was Lila, and that Mara Diaz was her mother. She said he had not listened to her. The words landed like stones in still water, spreading rings of unease through him. Adrian sat back in his chair, the drawing bright against the dark wood of his desk. And for the first time all day, he felt the certainty of his decisions begin to crack. Adrian stared at the child in front of him, the folded drawing spread across his desk like a truth he could not escape. The office was silent except for the faint hum of the city outside, and in that silence her words fell sharp and clear. "You didn't listen to my mom." He had sat through countless boardroom challenges, investors questioning his choices, competitors attacking his strategies, and none of them had unsettled him the way this small voice just had. He tried to compose himself, to hold on to the steady calm that usually guided him, but the look in her eyes made it impossible. Lila's gaze did not waver. They were dark eyes, steady and certain, the kind of eyes that came from knowing disappointment too well for someone so young. She wasn't angry, she wasn't shouting, she wasn't pleading, but the quiet way she spoke carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Adrian leaned back slightly, as if the leather chair might shield him from what he was feeling, but the words kept echoing inside him. "You didn't listen." He tried to say something reasonable, that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made, that companies could not survive on excuses, that every employee had to carry their weight. The sentences sounded smooth in his head but fell flat the moment he thought about speaking them out loud. How could he explain efficiency and productivity to a girl who had walked into his office with shoes worn at the edges and a picture drawn in marker lines? How could he speak about numbers when she had spoken about her mother? Lila pointed at the drawing again, her small finger landing on the figure of a woman holding a child's hand. She said softly that her mom worked late because she had to, that sometimes she came home tired, but always smiled for her, that the only reason she was late was because she was making sure Lila could breathe when her chest hurt at night. Adrian felt his throat tighten, the words painting pictures more vivid than any file HR had placed on his desk. He thought about the folder, neat and cold, listing lateness and absences like flaws carved into stone. Now he imagined those same lines, rewritten with her explanations beside them, and suddenly the story looked very different. He wondered how many times he had signed his name without ever knowing the weight those papers carried outside the office walls. The girl stood there quietly after speaking, her hands clasped in front of her, her shoulders straight though she was so small. She had delivered her truth and left it there, unpolished but undeniable. Adrian looked at her, then at the drawing, then back again, and realized with an unfamiliar sting that for the first time in years he had been caught completely unprepared. His calm, polished armor had cracked, not from a corporate rival or a courtroom fight, but from a child reminding him that listening was not the same as hearing. The paper lay on Adrian's desk, its edges frayed from being folded and unfolded, the bright marker colors standing out against the polished wood. It was not the kind of image he usually studied in this office, not a chart or a graph or a carefully drawn blueprint, but a child's sketch with uneven lines and bold strokes of color. He saw the tall shape of a building, crooked windows that seemed to tilt downward as if they might break, and at the base of it, a woman holding the hand of a small girl. Above their heads, in large, uneven letters, were the words, "Please don't let us fall." The phrase was simple, but it sank into him with a weight heavier than the thick reports stacked neatly on his desk. Adrian had spent years thinking of buildings in terms of investments and numbers, floor counts and valuations, but he had never thought of one as something fragile, leaning, threatening to collapse around the people inside. Yet that was exactly how the drawing looked, as if the building itself was alive and hostile, waiting for the two figures below to slip. The woman's face was round and unfinished, but the way the little girl had drawn her hand, gripping tightly, told the whole story. The girl had drawn herself smaller, clutching that hand as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. He glanced at Lila, who stood straight, watching him carefully, her small chin lifted as if braced for disbelief. She did not fidget. She did not shuffle her feet. She simply waited, and he realized she was used to waiting for adults to decide whether they would hear her or ignore her. He tapped the edge of the paper with his finger and asked if she had drawn it for her mother. Lila nodded, her voice quiet when she answered that she made it last night after her mom told her she might have to leave her job. She said she wanted him to understand what that meant, that without her mom's job the windows of the building would break, and they would fall together. Adrian felt something stir in him that he could not name. He thought of the folder HR had given him, the one that listed late arrivals and missed metrics, without mention of nights spent in waiting rooms or mornings spent catching buses that never came on time. The file had looked clean and final, but the drawing made the story messy and human, full of fear and love in colors that could not be measured on a spreadsheet. The girl placed her hand flat on the paper, as if to keep it from sliding away. She said again that he had not listened, not really, that the picture was her way of showing him what words could not. Adrian swallowed hard, the city skyline blurring behind him through the glass walls, and for the first time in years he felt his certainty falter. The drawing was not just a plea, it was an indictment, and he knew he could not push it aside. Adrian sat in his chair with the drawing still on his desk, its bright lines pulling his attention away from the cold glow of the spreadsheets on his screen. He had built his career on quick decisions, on moving through files and numbers with speed, trimming what he called inefficiencies before they spread, never pausing long enough to consider what he might be cutting away. But now the quiet weight of a child's picture pressed against his chest in a way he could not ignore. "Please don't let us fall," the words echoed again, sharper than any memo he had ever read. For the first time in years, hesitation settled into him like a shadow he could not shake. He thought of the HR notes he had signed without looking twice, the repeated mention of lateness, absences, fatigue, He had always trusted those words as facts, as proof that the person behind them had failed. But now he saw them differently. What if lateness was not carelessness, but something harder? Something like a child with an asthma attack in the middle of the night. Something like a bus that never came because the city's routes had been cut again. Something like a mother choosing her daughter's safety over the clock on the wall. He rubbed his temples and leaned back, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much of the truth he had thrown away under the weight of neat little bullet points. The silence in his office grew heavier, broken only by the faint hum of the air system and the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. He thought about Mara's tired eyes, the few times he had glimpsed her passing in the hallway, eyes that seemed to carry more than a day's work. He remembered now how she kept her head down, how she avoided lingering near the coffee stations, how she rarely smiled. He had dismissed those things as signs of weakness, never once considering they might have been signs of exhaustion from a life lived on the edge of survival. Adrian's hand hovered over the drawing again, his fingers tracing the jagged outline of the tilted building. He wondered how many buildings he had tilted without ever knowing, how many families he had sent teetering with the sweep of his pen. It unsettled him, this sudden awareness that his decisions were not as clean as he liked to imagine. Numbers might not lie, but they never told the full story either. He shifted in his chair, the weight of that realization making him restless, a crack appearing in the solid wall of certainty he had always built around himself. He looked at Lila again, still standing by the desk, her small frame steady, her eyes older than they should be. She had forced him to pause, to ask the question he had never asked before. What lies behind the numbers? And though he did not yet know the answer, he knew he could no longer pretend it did not matter. Adrian had faced sharp questions from journalists, lawyers, and rivals, but nothing had ever struck him the way Lila's voice did in that moment. She stood there, in front of his desk, her hands folded behind her back, her drawing still lying between them like evidence that could not be erased. Her head tilted slightly, her tone even and soft, not bitter, not angry, just curious, in the way children asked when they wanted to understand the world. She looked up at him and asked if being rich made him too busy to see people. The words settled into the air like dust that refused to fall. Adrian opened his mouth to answer quickly, out of habit, to deliver some polished line about responsibility and schedules and the demands of leadership. Yet when he looked at her steady eyes, eyes that carried none of the suspicion of adults, but only a need for truth, the words stuck in his throat. He closed his mouth again and leaned back slowly, feeling the question work its way deeper than any accusation could have. He thought of the years he had spent climbing toward the seat he now held, the endless nights of work, the missed dinners, the phone calls cut short because the next deal always mattered more. He had told himself it was worth it, that the sacrifices were necessary, that one day all the success would mean something. But sitting across from a child who asked him so simply if wealth made him blind, he felt the uncomfortable weight of all the people he had not seen. The assistant who had stopped smiling months ago, the janitor who worked late shifts unnoticed, the employees who left quietly when they no longer fit the mold he demanded. Lila's question was not an attack. It was not spoken with the sharp edge of blame, but it pierced deeper because of that. She wanted to know, and she expected him to answer honestly. He studied her small face, the way her expression remained calm but expectant, as if she was holding him to a standard no adult had dared to hold him to. Adrian cleared his throat and admitted that maybe sometimes he was too busy. Maybe sometimes the weight of his work made him forget to see the people behind the reports and the numbers. The admission tasted strange on his tongue, like a language he had almost forgotten how to speak. Lila nodded slowly, as though she had expected nothing less, and then asked why, if he was so busy, he thought he had time to decide when her mother's job should end. The question stung in its innocence, because she was not trying to wound him, she was only speaking a truth that seemed obvious to her. He felt the crack in his certainty widen, and for the first time in years, He did not feel like the master of the room. He felt like a man being asked by a child to look in a mirror he had long avoided. The sound of hurried footsteps filled the hallway before the office door swung wide. Mara appeared in the doorway, her face flushed, breath uneven from running, her hand still clutching the strap of her worn handbag, as if she had dragged it along without thinking. For a moment she froze, her eyes darting from Adrian behind the wide desk to the small figure of her daughter, standing bravely in front of him. Fear flashed across her face, sharp and raw, as if she expected the floor itself to swallow her whole. She hurried into the room and reached for Lila's shoulder, her voice shaking as she scolded her in whispers that trembled with panic. What had she done? What had possessed her to walk into the CEO's office? What kind of trouble had she brought upon them both? Mara's gaze lifted to Adrian then, and in her eyes he saw resignation, the look of a woman who had already accepted defeat. She seemed ready for the humiliation, ready for him to remind her of her place, ready for another dismissal, this time not on paper but face to face. Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not send them away. Instead, he lifted his hand from the desk and gestured to the sheet of paper lying there between them, the uneven lines of a child's drawing standing bright against the polished wood. Mara blinked, her breath catching, as if she had not expected to see anything but anger. Her eyes flickered down and landed on the image, the crooked building, the two figures holding hands, the words written above in bold, uneven letters. For a long moment no one spoke. The city lights beyond the glass walls seemed to hum louder in the silence. Mara's grip on her daughter's shoulder softened as she stared at the drawing, her lips parting in disbelief. Lila looked up at her mother with quiet certainty, then back at Adrian, as though she had done the only thing left to be done. Adrian leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the desk, his expression unreadable. He asked softly if this was what her life felt like. If this building in the picture was her world, tilting and breaking above her. Mara swallowed hard, unable to answer at first, but her eyes glistened with the truth she had tried so hard to keep hidden. Finally she nodded, almost imperceptibly, and whispered that sometimes it felt exactly like that. She tried to explain, her words tumbling quickly, about the buses that ran late, about the clinic visits that could not be missed, about the exhaustion that came from trying to be both mother and worker, without failing at either. She apologized again and again, as if her life itself was an inconvenience, as if speaking honestly was a kind of trespass. Adrian did not stop her, did not cut her off with the sharp finality of a signature. He simply listened, and that act alone seemed to unravel something inside the room. Mara braced herself for judgment, but what she found instead was silence that felt less like condemnation and more like consideration. Adrian's gaze lingered on the drawing once more, then lifted to hers, and in that moment, she saw not dismissal, but doubt breaking through the wall he had built around himself. Mara stood stiffly in front of the desk, one hand still resting on her daughter's shoulder, her voice caught between apology and defiance. She looked as though she expected every word to be used against her, every detail twisted into another reason she did not belong here. Adrian stayed quiet, his eyes steady, not with the coldness she had seen earlier, but with something that looked almost like patience. The silence stretched until Mara realized he was waiting, not for excuses, but for the truth. Her chest rose and fell as she drew in a long breath. She told him about the bus schedules that never lined up, about leaving the apartment before dawn only to find the route canceled, about standing with her daughter in the dark when the city still slept, praying a driver would come. She told him about the clinic visits, how Lila's lungs sometimes tightened without warning, how an inhaler was never enough, how the nurses knew them by name because they showed up so often. Each story slipped out of her like a confession she had carried too long, and with each word her voice grew steadier, less afraid. Adrian listened. He leaned back in his chair, his hands folded loosely, his expression unreadable but attentive. He did not interrupt, he did not tell her what she should have done differently. He simply let the weight of her sentences fill the room. She explained how she had rushed from emergency rooms straight to the office, how she had sat at her desk with worry gnawing at her chest, trying to focus on compliance reports while wondering if her daughter was breathing easily at school. She admitted she had been late, that she had missed deadlines, that the record in her file was not false, only incomplete. Her eyes glistened, but she did not cry. She said she had learned to keep her voice level, because tears only made people impatient, because emotions were treated like weakness. She said she had kept silent because every time she tried to explain, supervisors nodded politely and reminded her of policy, as if policies raised children or soothed wheezing lungs. She said the hardest part was knowing no one ever asked why. No one cared to look past the numbers, and eventually she had stopped trying to tell them. Adrian felt each word strike against the armor he had built around his decisions. Numbers had been his shield, the clean way to measure truth. Yet now, those same numbers looked small compared to the reality she described. He remembered signing the dismissal order without hesitation, how final it had felt, how efficient, and now he saw how shallow that finality had been. He realized he had reduced a life into a file, a family into statistics, and he wondered how many others had been pushed out of his company with stories that never reached his ears. Mara's voice softened as she finished, her hand brushing her daughter's hair, her shoulders no longer stiff but heavy with relief. For the first time, someone had listened, really listened, and the air in the office felt changed. Adrian did not know yet what he would do, but he knew this conversation had cracked something open, something that could never be closed again. Adrian sat very still, after Mara's words faded into silence, the weight of them lingering in the room like smoke. He found himself staring at the child's drawing on his desk, the crooked building with the broken windows, and for reasons he could not quite name, it stirred something deep inside him, something he had worked hard to keep hidden beneath years of polished ambition. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment, and when he did, another image rose up uninvited, not of spreadsheets or towers of glass, but of a small apartment with peeling paint and the sound of a clock ticking past midnight. He remembered his mother, her coat pulled tight around her shoulders as she returned home from the diner, her shoes damp from the long walk across town, her hands cracked from too much dish soap and too little rest. He remembered the way she tried to smile when she found him still awake, pretending to study, though his eyes were heavy. He remembered the small sigh she let slip before she kissed his forehead and told him not to worry. But he had worried, even as a boy, because he saw how her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was looking, how her paychecks never stretched far enough, how her pride kept her standing, even when her body begged for rest. Adrian remembered nights when she fell asleep at the table, her head resting on her arm, the bills spread out like puzzles she could not solve. He had sat quietly then, watching her the way children do, memorizing the weight she carried, vowing that one day he would take that weight away. But before he could, her employer had called her tardy one time too many, dismissed her as if she were disposable, as if her sacrifices counted for nothing. He remembered how she cried in the kitchen that night, thinking he was asleep, how she whispered apologies to no one, and how he swore in that moment that he would build a life where no one could ever humiliate them again. That memory had fueled him for years, shaping the choices that drove him higher, harder, faster than others. He had buried it beneath ambition, convincing himself that numbers were truth, that rules kept the world fair, that emotions only made people weak. But now, as Mara stood in front of him, with her daughter by her side, the memory returned sharp and clear, reminding him that behind every statistic there was a story, behind every lateness a reason, behind every tired pair of eyes a fight to survive. He opened his eyes and looked at Mara again, and for a moment he saw not an employee with failures listed in a file, but a woman like his mother, carrying more than she should, dismissed by people who never asked why. His chest tightened with the knowledge that he had become one of them, the very kind of man he had once promised himself he would never be. Adrian left his office with the drawing still on his desk and Mara's voice echoing in his ears. He walked down the wide glass corridor, the same path he had traveled countless times before, but today it felt different, heavier. The walls reflected the city skyline, cold and sharp, and for the first time, he noticed how much it resembled the atmosphere inside his own company. The faces he passed were focused, efficient, and distant. Assistants hurried by with tablets clutched against their chests, their steps quick, their eyes fixed ahead. No one smiled, not even politely, and he wondered how long it had been since he had noticed that simple absence. In the main work area, rows of desks stretched beneath white light, the rhythm of keyboards and clicking mice filling the space like a mechanical hum. The employees looked absorbed, but not inspired. Their expressions were tight, lips pressed together, brows furrowed, shoulders hunched, as though every mistake carried more weight than they could bear. Adrian slowed his pace, watching the way they avoided eye contact, how conversations were clipped and hurried, not exchanges of ideas, but instructions passed down like orders in a factory. He had called it productivity, but now it looked more like survival. A manager stopped near the far end of the room, speaking to a young man who had a worried crease in his forehead. Adrian lingered, just close enough to hear. The manager's tone was sharp, though polite, reminding him of rules, deadlines, policy. The young man nodded quickly, murmured apologies, and turned back to his screen with shoulders that seemed to shrink. Adrian realized there had been no question of why, no attempt to understand, only correction and compliance. He thought of Mara's file and how easily her story had been reduced to numbers, and now he saw that same reduction happening all around him. He moved through the next department, past a team huddled around charts projected on the wall. Their leader spoke in precise terms about efficiency metrics, about trimming fat and reducing costs. Adrian had heard this language for years and once admired it, but now it sounded brittle. He watched the team nod mechanically, pens scribbling notes, but there was no spark in their faces, no sign of pride in their work. It was as if the humanity had been drained from the place and replaced with procedures. As he continued walking, doubt pressed harder against him. He remembered his mother's tired face, Mara's quiet explanation, Lila's steady question. All at once, the truth became impossible to ignore. He had built towers of glass that reflected the city's brilliance. But inside those towers, people were bending beneath the weight of rules that saw them as cogs. Efficiency had been achieved, yes, but at the cost of warmth, at the cost of human dignity. For the first time, Adrian felt the floor beneath him tilt slightly, the crack in his certainty widening into something he could no longer patch with numbers. The boardroom was a long stretch of glass and polished wood, the kind of place designed to project certainty. Adrian sat at the head of the table, the skyline behind him, glowing in the late afternoon haze. His executives gathered around with their tablets and laptops open like shields. They were used to numbers, to charts, to forecasts that could be debated in percentages and margins. But what he was about to say had no neat column or tidy graph. He cleared his throat, spoke steadily, and told them about Mara Diaz. The reaction came quickly. A murmur of scoffs, a few incredulous glances traded across the table, and then the chorus of objections began. One executive leaned forward, reminding him that the company had policies for a reason, that lateness and absence could not be tolerated because they spread like contagion. Another shook his head and said compassion was expensive, that if they made an exception for one employee, then every employee would expect the same. A third executive smiled thinly, calling it a noble thought but impractical, because rules were clean and people were messy. Their words stacked up like bricks, building a wall of polished logic against his suggestion. Adrian listened, his fingers steepled in front of him, his face calm, though inside the doubt pressed heavier. He had heard these arguments before. In fact, he had once spoken them himself. He had told others that consistency mattered more than circumstance, that fairness meant everyone was treated the same, that policies protected the company from chaos. But now, with Mara's face clear in his mind and Lila's voice reminding him what it meant not to listen, the words sounded brittle, like glass about to shatter. He tried to push back gently, asking them what fairness really meant, if it ignored the reasons behind the numbers, if it punished struggle as if it were negligence. One executive countered immediately, saying, leadership was not about feelings, it was about protecting the structure that kept everyone employed. Another chimed in that bending rules for one person would set a precedent they could never contain. Adrian noticed how easily they spoke about Mara without ever saying her name, how she had already been reduced in their minds to a concept, a problem, a risk. The conversation circled, sharp and efficient. Their voices clipped, their logic neat. But beneath their words, Adrian felt a growing unease. He thought of the drawing still on his desk, the crooked building with broken windows, the words written in a child's hand, "Please, don't let us fall." He thought of his mother standing in a kitchen, after being dismissed for lateness, her sacrifice unseen, her story ignored. And he realized the executives at his table were repeating the same blindness, cloaking it in professionalism, but blindness all the same. When the meeting ended, the room was filled with the rustle of papers and the click of laptops closing. The others left confident in their reasoning, certain they had defended order. Adrian remained seated for a long moment, staring at the empty chairs, his reflection caught in the glossy table. Their words echoed, but they no longer felt like truth. For the first time, he wondered if the clean rules he had built his empire on were nothing more than walls to keep him from seeing what was real. Adrian sat alone in his office long after the building had gone quiet. The only sounds the hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the glass panels settling in the night air. The city sprawled beneath him, glowing with 1,000 points of light, but his gaze kept returning to the paper lying on his desk. Lila's drawing, simple and uneven, held more power than all the reports stacked neatly in binders along his shelves. The crooked building with broken windows, the two figures holding hands, and above them the words written in thick marker, "Please don't let us fall." The phrase pulsed in his mind until it was louder than the traffic streaming below. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, and studied the details again. The child had drawn the building as though it were leaning forward, ready to crush the two small figures beneath it. He thought of all the buildings he had raised, glass towers built to house companies like his, symbols of progress, strength, and control. Yet in her picture, the tower was not a place of success but a threat. He realized with a slow, unsettling clarity that to some, his company looked the same way, a force too large, too rigid, pressing down on those who struggled to stand. Adrian let out a long breath and rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of choices he had once believed were simple. He had trusted numbers because they were clean, but now numbers felt hollow. They could not measure the exhaustion in Mara's eyes or the steadiness in Lila's voice. They could not explain the difference between negligence and sacrifice. For years he had convinced himself that efficiency was compassion in its own way, that building a strong company meant giving people stability. But stability meant nothing if it crushed those who needed support the most. The city lights blurred as he stared through the window, and he remembered being a boy again, watching his mother's shoulders slump at the kitchen table when her employer dismissed her struggles as lateness. He remembered swearing that one day he would build a life where no one could humiliate them like that again. Somewhere along the climb, he had forgotten that promise. He had built walls of glass and steel, but lost sight of the people living in their shadows. Adrian reached for the drawing and held it in his hands, the paper soft from being folded so many times. He imagined Lila's small fingers pressing the marker into the page, determined to be heard even when she doubted anyone would listen. He felt something shift inside him, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, like a door opening in a long, closed room. He realized he could not undo what had already been done, but he could decide differently now. He could begin to see people before numbers. He could make sure voices like Mara's and Lila's were not silenced by the weight of clean rules. The skyline shimmered outside, but the words on the page burned brighter. Please, don't let us fall. Adrian whispered to himself that he would not. The next morning, Mara walked into the building with heavy steps, her shoulders drawn tight, as if bracing for another blow. She had received the call late the night before, a calm voice from the executive assistant, telling her that Mr. Cross wanted her to return, that he would meet with her personally. She had not slept much, lying awake beside her daughter, wondering what it meant. In her mind, the possibilities circled endlessly, but most of them ended the same way, with more rejection, more humiliation, more proof that she did not belong in the high glass towers of people who never had to choose between groceries and bus fare. She carried no box this time, only her handbag, and the familiar ache of worry. Lila had begged her to be brave, her small hand clutching hers at the school gates, whispering that maybe this was the start of something different. Mara had smiled weakly and kissed her forehead, but inside she did not dare hope. She had learned long ago that hope often cost more than disappointment. When she reached the top floor, the receptionist greeted her with polite neutrality, then led her down the quiet corridor to the office she had dreaded. The door was already open. Adrian stood behind his desk, the city sprawling bright behind him in the morning Sunday. He gestured for her to come in, his expression unreadable, not cold, not exactly warm either, but carrying a steadiness she did not expect. Mara stepped inside, her palms damp, her heart racing. She began to apologize at once, saying she did not mean to cause trouble yesterday, that her daughter should never have barged in, that she understood why she had been let go and would not make excuses. Her words tumbled quickly, like stones she wanted to drop before they weighed her down. But Adrian lifted a hand gently and stopped her. He pointed to the chair across from his desk and asked her to sit. She hesitated, then lowered herself onto the edge of the seat, ready for another speech about policy and performance. Instead, he looked at her directly and spoke 3 words she never expected. "Tell me everything." The air shifted. Mara blinked, certain she had misheard, but his expression did not change. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the desk, waiting, not as a man about to deliver judgment, but as someone willing, finally, to listen. The words cracked something inside her, a barrier she had built after years of being dismissed and ignored. For a moment, she could not answer, her throat tight with disbelief. Then slowly, carefully, she began to speak. She told him about the mornings that started before sunrise, about waiting with her daughter for buses that never came. She told him about rushing to clinics with an inhaler clutched in her hand, about the long nights of fear when Lila's chest rose too shallowly. She told him about juggling bills, about stretching paychecks, about the exhaustion that clung to her no matter how hard she tried. Adrian listened, without interruption, his eyes steady, his hands still, and for the first time in a very long time, Mara felt that her words were not falling into emptiness. Adrian leaned back in his chair with a notebook open in front of him. Not the sleek reports his team prepared, but a plain pad of paper filled with ideas scribbled in his own hand. Mara sat across from him, still a little wary, her posture careful, but her voice steadier than before. They had been meeting for hours, her explaining what employees like her struggled with, him listening and asking questions that no executive in his company had bothered to ask. The more she spoke, the clearer it became to him that the problems in his company were not rooted in laziness or incompetence, but in a structure that demanded perfection from people whose lives were full of unpredictable storms. They began with schedules. Mara described how impossible it was to make the rigid morning start times when buses broke down, or when a child's breathing turned ragged in the night. She explained how 5 minutes late became a black mark, how one absence became a warning, until the record itself looked like negligence when it was really survival. Adrian tapped his pen against the paper and wrote flex schedules, his mind already turning through ways to build systems that trusted employees rather than punished them. Then they moved to childcare. Mara told him about the high costs, the scramble for someone reliable, the anxiety of leaving her daughter in a place she could barely afford while she worked to keep that very place paid for. Adrian listened, his jaw tightening as he realized how many of his workers were carrying the same quiet burden. He wrote childcare support on the page, underlined it, and told Mara he wanted to build a partnership with local centers, maybe even fund one in-house, so no parent had to choose between showing up and keeping their child safe. Transportation came next. Mara described the nights she left the office after dark, waiting for buses that arrived late or never at all, carrying the fear of being stranded miles from home. She spoke of mornings spent racing against unreliable schedules, of money wasted on rideshares when she had nothing left to spare. Adrian wrote transportation stipends on the page, circling it, imagining passes and allowances that would free his employees from the constant anxiety of simply getting to work. As they spoke, the list grew. Health clinics on site, paid leave that recognized family emergencies, mentorship programs to guide employees who had potential but lacked support. The numbers in Adrian's head began to reshape themselves, no longer cold measures of productivity, but tools to protect the people who gave his company its strength. He thought of Lila's drawing, the words, "Please don't let us fall," and realized this was how to answer them. Not with charity, not with pity, but with systems that caught people before they broke. Mara's eyes softened as she watched him write. She had walked into his office expecting to be discarded again, but now she was helping redesign the very place that had nearly crushed her. Adrian felt something steady settle in his chest, the quiet resolve of a man rewriting not just policies, but his own way of seeing the world. The morning of the launch dawned bright, the glass towers catching the early sun so that the city itself seemed to glow. Adrian stood near the entrance of his headquarters, a wide ribbon stretched across the lobby. Reporters clustered on one side, employees gathered on the other. The program they were unveiling had taken weeks to prepare but years to realize, a redesign of company policies that finally placed people at the center. Flex schedules, childcare support, transportation stipends, ideas once dismissed as too messy or too expensive, were now written into the company's foundation. And standing at the center of it all, holding a pair of oversized scissors nearly too big for her hands, was Lila. Her dress was simple, the kind a child wears for a school picture, but her expression was steady and serious. She looked at the crowd the way she had looked at Adrian that first day in his office, unflinching, as though she knew she was about to do something that mattered. Mara stood close by, her hand on her daughter's shoulder, pride shining through her nervousness. Adrian watched them both, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, though he kept his posture straight and formal. When the time came, the company's communications director gave a brief speech about progress and commitment, about the importance of recognizing that numbers were built on human effort. Then Adrian stepped forward, and instead of delivering a long address, he simply thanked everyone for being there and turned to Lila. He crouched slightly so his eyes met hers, handed her the scissors with both hands, and said softly that this was her moment. The blades closed on the ribbon with a crisp snap, and the lobby erupted in applause. For a moment Adrian looked at the faces of his employees, faces he had passed for years without really seeing. Something had shifted in them. They were smiling, not with the stiff politeness of people told to attend a corporate event, but with a genuine sense of being part of something real. Their applause wasn't just for the program. It was for the acknowledgement, for the fact that their lives had been seen. Reporters jotted notes, cameras flashed, but what struck Adrian most was the way his people looked at him, not as a softer man, not as someone weakened by sentiment, but as a clearer leader, one who had finally begun to listen. He saw respect in their eyes, and something deeper too, a trust that had not been there before. Lila handed the scissors back with a grin that revealed the child behind the seriousness. Adrian took them gently, and felt the weight of what she had given him. Not just a program to launch, but a chance to rebuild his company on truth instead of numbers alone. As the applause faded, he looked at the crowd and knew this was only the beginning. The first change had been made, and it had come not from a boardroom strategy, but from a child's drawing that refused to be ignored. Adrian closed the door to his office after the celebration and stood still for a moment, the sounds of laughter and conversation from the lobby still echoing faintly down the hall. The room was quiet now, the kind of quiet that allowed him to breathe differently, slower, deeper, not as a man rushing from one decision to the next, but as someone who had seen what listening could build. His eyes moved to his desk, and there it was, sitting in a simple wooden frame, the drawing that had started everything. The crooked building with broken windows, the small figure of a woman holding her daughter's hand, and above them the words written in bold, uneven strokes, "Please don't let us fall." He walked closer and rested his hand lightly against the frame, remembering the day Lila had placed it on the polished wood with all the courage her 7-year-old body could hold. At the time he had seen it as an interruption, something that cracked his carefully ordered world. But now he understood it was the truth he had been avoiding, the truth that numbers could never show. It was not evidence of weakness, not a sentimental distraction, but a reminder that strength came from listening, from seeing, from refusing to let people slip through the cracks. Mara stepped into the office quietly, her daughter by her side, both of them still carrying the glow of the morning's event. She looked at the drawing too, her lips curving into a smile touched with disbelief, as if she still found it hard to believe her child's sketch now hung in the office of the man who once dismissed her. Adrian gestured for them to come closer, and when they stood beside him, he said softly that this was not just a decoration, it was a promise. Mara nodded, and her eyes glistened, though she blinked quickly to steady herself. Lila climbed into the chair across from the desk, her legs swinging above the floor, and she studied the framed picture with the solemn pride only a child could carry. She asked if it would stay there forever, and Adrian answered yes, not just on the desk, but in the choices he made from now on. She leaned back, satisfied, then pulled another piece of paper from her small bag, a new drawing made that morning, this one of 3 figures standing together in front of a building, not broken, but whole, with sunlight drawn in thick yellow lines. Adrian took it in his hands and felt something steady rise inside him. The man who once believed that empires were built only on discipline and precision now understood that they could also be saved by voices small enough to be overlooked. He placed the new drawing beside the framed one and smiled at Mara and Lila, seeing not an employee and her child, but the family he had not known he was missing. The empire outside the glass walls would keep demanding, but here, in this room, he had found what gave it meaning. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.